You Saddams and you Bushes, you Bin Ladens and snakes, you billionaire bullies, you a globalized curse. You put war on the masses and then you clean out the purse. And that's how it's done. War after war. You old feudal parasites, you just sacrifice the poor. You got the cutting edge weapons.
Thank you for tuning in to Heroes and Patriots. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, March 31st, 2022, the fifth Thursday of the month. And we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. It is 1 minute past the hour. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowicz. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning, listeners at KMUD Radio.
Today's program and all programs will be archived here at kmud.org and our program website, heroespatriots.org. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guest, 707-923-3911. We do ask you to please be brief with your question. Our engineer today is Dennis Meyer. We thank him for sitting in for Dorothy. Views and opinions expressed during this program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, volunteers, members, or underwriters of KMUD Community Radio. John, before we get started, I wanted to mention a letter that you and I both received individually, and that is the KMUD Spring Silent Drive for 2022. And I was reading through it, and it's talking about how important KMUD is to the community, especially as we approach fire season. And it has a breakout of membership and business membership, sustaining how you can give for $10, $20, $30 monthly. So I do hope that you will check your mail to give to KMUD. John and I are going to put our check in one envelope and send it in. The other way that you can give to the Silent Drive is by checking out the website, which has a donate now button or donate button that you can easily, it takes about 2 minutes. That's how I originally became a member. So it's easy, it's quick, and it's quiet, and you can do it in your own leisure.
And I want to jump in on that as well. So if you're listening right now, you should become a member. All programmers, not just Mary and myself, work very hard to bring you quality programming. Mary and I do a show on national security, and we have A-list guests, and we speak to the most important national security and foreign policy subjects. Today, we'll be talking about the war in Ukraine with our guest in just a moment. But more than that, you become part of a family here. Our business model here at KMUD is that of community radio, which should be differentiated from public radio.
Right.
Community radio is, even though it has very few salaried people who make far less than other public radio stations, it's really a people-driven, people-powered radio station. And when you become a member, you become part of that community. And I want to say you become part of a family. You become part of a family of informed, progressive, loving people, including our engineer who's, volunteering today at 9 a.m. in the morning. I don't know where he drove in from, but it's a cold studio. He's all bundled up in his hoodie. He exemplifies the kind of people-powered station that we have. So please become a member of our family.
Thank you, John. So we're going to begin our program today, and as many of our listeners know, we are starting the fifth week of the invasion by Russia in Ukraine, and we're going to talk about Israel's abandonment of Ukraine. This is an article written by our guest, Richard Silverstein. Mr. Silverstein has been writing Tikun Olam, one of the earliest progressive Jewish blogs, since February 2003. And his blog focuses on exposing the excesses of the Israeli national security state. I want to mention that a number of lawmakers on Capitol Hill are growing increasingly frustrated with what they see as Israel's lack of action in response to Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. So, with having said that, let's bring in our guest, Richard Silverstein. Welcome back, Richard.
Hi, great to be with you again.
Thank you for joining us, and you're way up in the northern part of the country.
We
Richard,
are in the beautiful Pacific Northwest.
Richard, it's great to have you back on our show. You've been a guest before, and you are certainly one of the more interesting guests. And I would say that that a lot of your writing actually puts you at risk. I don't know whether that's ever been the case, but once you become an enemy of Israel and its lobbying group in Washington D.C., they'll find all kinds of ways to discredit you, to impeach you, to hurt you. So that said, I applaud you for your honesty and your intelligence and for your stamina.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
I really do, my friend. So in the events that have unfolded in Ukraine during the past 3 weeks, to me, the role of Israel is by far the most interesting. The role of Israel can adequately be appraised only by taking into account the financial interests of the oligarchs who have second homes there, who have passports there, who have taken their yachts there and their private jets. Please explain to our audience what the role of Israel has been in this terrible war between Russia and the Ukraine.
Well, Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, I think, thought that he had an opportunity to sort of burnish his political credentials at home and also to be a sort of global statesman by playing a role of mediating between the two sides, because Israel has many Ukrainian Jews who are citizens of the state who came 20, 30 years ago to Israel from what was then the Soviet Union. And also, Israel has very close relations with Putin and Russia because of Russia's role in Syria. As your listeners may know, there's been a civil war of sorts in Syria for the last 10 or 15 years, and Russia has been a loyal ally of the Assad regime along with Iran, but we're talking mostly about Russia at this point. And Israel also has interest in Syria because Syria is one of the frontline states that Israel deals with. And Israel is a sworn enemy of Hezbollah, the Lebanese Islamist group, political movement, and Hezbollah played a role in Syria and propping up the Assad regime as well. So that's why Bennett thought he could play this role, and he actually he went to Moscow and spoke to Putin, and then went to the Ukrainians and essentially offered the Ukrainians Putin's deal. Instead of serving as a real mediator, he basically told the Ukrainians, take Putin's deal, it's the best you're going to get. The Ukrainians weren't too happy about that, and an unnamed high-level Ukrainian official said Israel is basically serving as an errand boy for Putin. And the mediation effort by Bennett didn't really go very far. He had proposed the two sides meeting in Jerusalem. Instead, we have the two sides now meeting in Turkey. And that's more realistic in terms of Turkey's powerful role in the region, and also its ability to sort of be an honest broker between the two sides if that was necessary. So another issue is the issue of refugees. We know that I don't know what the latest count is, but the last time I checked, it was 3.5 million Ukrainian refugees. Mostly they're going to Europe through Poland and other countries that border Ukraine. But many refugees wanted to come to Israel. However, Israel is what I would call a theocratic state. In other words, Judaism is the primary religion in Israel. Even though there are 1 million Muslim and Christian citizens of Israel, Israel is a Jewish state. and I don't mean that sort of in a benign way. The practice of Judaism in Israel is, what I call Judeo supremacy. So the ministers who were dealing with the refugee issue basically said, we will take Ukrainian Jews, but we will not take Ukrainian non-Jews. So they put up barriers to non-Jews coming to Israel. They told them that they would have to make a $3,000 deposit if they wanted to come. They could come for a month and then they had to leave. And the only way that they would get their deposit back is if they did leave. Basically, now that issue has disappeared from the table, but it lingers in terms of the toxicity of making religion one of the primary factors of the identity of your state.
One more follow-up question, and then it's Mary's turn. Back to the oligarchs themselves.
Right, right.
Many, I have always felt that the best chance for a regime change in Russia were the oligarchs themselves. Let's face it, money makes the world go round, and these oligarchs are some of the world's richest people, and they're some of the scariest people as well. But they have this uneasy modus vivendi with Putin because a lot of their wealth is based on Russian assets that were purchased at a fraction of their actual value, and if they rub Putin the wrong way, these assets will be returned to their rightful owners, the Russian people. So these oligarchs have this uneasy truce with the boss. Yet many of these same oligarchs have Israeli assets and citizenships. They don't want them revealed. It would complicate their relations with Putin, and yet they remain probably the most viable force for financing. They're openly or covertly a regime change in Russia. Where are the oligarchs? Where do they stand? What are you hearing? How realistic is it that the oligarchs will lead a revolution?
Well, let's go back to an earlier part of your question, that is talk about the oligarchs both in relation to Putin and in relation to Israel. There are, I would say, maybe 8 to 10 Russian Jewish oligarchs who, as you said, basically sort of rapaciously stole state assets in the period when the Soviet Union disintegrated and became Russia. And they basically stole state assets and turned them into huge monopolies that they benefited from, and also they served Putin by sharing the stolen wealth with him, and he's now worth, God only knows, 50 billion, more than that. So you have these 8 to 10 oligarchs who sort of spread their network outside of Russia in order to sort of launder their wealth, and they did that in the West by buying properties, penthouse apartments in the West, in London, in New York, and in Tel Aviv. And so they also took citizenship in Israel, and among them are one of the chief oligarchs was Roman Abramovich. Your listeners may be familiar with him because he is the owner of the Chelsea Football Club in England, and has assets stashed away around the world. He also owns a $20 or so $1 million penthouse in Tel Aviv, along with some of these other oligarchs. And Israel has been very happy to take them as citizens of Israel because they bring this huge amount of wealth into the country. And it has also created this close relationship between Israel and Putin and Russia. But being an oligarch is a dicey proposition these days. So the West has sanctioned many of these oligarchs. It's denied them access to their assets. I was reading about one of them, Mikhail Friedman, who's in London, and he's complaining because he can't even take his friends out to a restaurant. All of his assets have been sanctioned by the UK authorities, and now they've put him on a diet he's applying for $3,000 a month. The poor guy. So the oligarchs have been denied their assets now because of what's going on. So some of them have felt like, well, we need to express our opposition to Putin and what he's doing, and some have done that, and some have basically retreated to Russia, and that Abramovich is one of those. So the first thing that Abramovich did, he was in London at the time of the beginning of the war, he came to Israel. And he wanted to make sure also that his yachts, his $700 million yacht, would not be confiscated in Europe. So he had the yacht go back to through the Mediterranean, and it ended up in Turkey, which is not sanctioning the oligarchs. But Abramovich went from London to Israel. Because Israel didn't have sanctions on them, the oligarchs, yet. And then he was seen in the Tel Aviv airport leaving Israel, and now he's in Turkey. Or actually, I think he went back to Russia, and I made a mistake about that. He went back to Russia, which was where he felt comfortable. But I noticed that even being an oligarch allied with Putin doesn't protect you, because Abramovich tried to engage in negotiations with the Ukrainians, and he met them. I can't remember if they met in Kiev.
Yes, right.
And Putin or one of his lackeys actually poisoned the negotiators, including Abramovich, who went blind for a period of time. So basically, if you're an oligarch and you step out of line, Putin will not just take you to task, Putin will punish you. The oligarchs are really in a very tenuous situation here. And I don't know about, who will topple Putin. I believe at some point it will happen. It may be the intelligence, the apparatus. It may be the military that do something like this. It could be the oligarchs. It could be a combination of all of them. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening at this point. But the oligarchs, if they turn against Putin, they could be a very powerful force for change in Russia. The problem will be that the oligarchs are damaged goods in the terms of the West. So they will not bring a democratic champion into power in Russia. They'll be somebody like themselves. So I don't know how much of a benefit it brings to swap out one corrupt dictator for another. But I guess we could say anything would probably be better than what we have now.
Yeah, anything would be better than a guy who's got his finger on the nuclear trigger and who embraces a policy of escalate to de-escalate, which was the subject of our last show. An insane strategic policy of using small tactical nukes to prevent a wholesale nuclear holocaust of big strategic nukes. But here's my thinking. There are a lot of mercenaries for hire. Here in the United States, it used to be Blackwater and Brown and Root and what have you. There are lots of mercenaries for hire. In the Ukrainian theater, there are Chechen mercenaries who are for hire, and these are super murderous people. These are like sociopaths. These are psychopaths. These are pathological people. Murder for hire. They'll murder whole villages if the price is right. So we know that mercenaries are for hire, and they're all over the world, including in Israel. What would it take just for these oligarchs just to say Putin is bad for business? He's got to go. The Russian people are ready for a change. There are protests in the streets. We just peel off, $1 billion out of our, out of our wallets, pay a group of mercenaries to take Putin out. I mean, that if I were one of the oligarchs, that would be my thinking. Is that just crazy thinking or what?
Well, I also want to throw in there, you mentioned the Chechens, but there's another major mercenary outfit called the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group sent its mercenaries, Russian mercenaries, to Syria. And in fact, I think that the U.S. at one point, a U.S. position in Syria was being attacked by the Wagner Group, and we sent in air power and basically wiped out the Wagner Group that was attacking the U.S. base. So we've had some. The Wagner Group has been in Libya, by the way. So we've had experience with the Wagner Group in terms of hostilities. And yes, the Chechens are in Ukraine, but their effectiveness has been really blunted by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians seem to have matched them in, their defense against Russia and against the Wagner Group. I mean, against the Chechens has been incredibly powerful. And I would say it is very possible that some of these mercenaries would be sort of either bought or co-opted into such a campaign. But we have to remember the Ukrainian resistance and defense has been really incredible. And I was reading that there is thought among analysts of the Ukrainian situation that the Wagner Group will, that Russia wants to get rid of the army in Ukraine because they've taken such a beating, and the plan might be to replace the soldiers from the army with the Wagner Group conscripts. But I don't think that's going to really help the Russians in Ukraine because if the Russian military can't make any headway in Ukraine, I don't see how conscripts recruited for $1 or 10 or a few tens of thousands of bucks are going to be able to really change the situation much for the Russians.
It is 23 minutes past the hour. If you've just joined the program, this is Heroes and Patriots, and we are speaking today with Richard Silverstein about the lack of real response, I should say, to the Ukrainian citizens. The U.S. gives Israel $3.8 billion a year in military foreign assistance, and in addition to about $500 million in missile defense. And yet, Israel has been reluctant to condemn Putin, to speak against the war. They're sympathetic to the Ukrainians, but they really haven't done much on condemning Putin. What do you think the U.S. wants Israel to do in response to this invasion?
Well, we have to go back a couple of weeks to when the United Nations attempted, the Security Council attempted to condemn the Ukrainian, Russian invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. proposed, along with the Europeans, resolution in the Security Council that would condemn Russia, and that was vetoed, of course, by Russia and I think China. So they went to the General Assembly, which is very unusual, and they went to the large UN body and asked the nations of the world to condemn Russia. Well, everybody in the world supported, everybody except for 5 countries supported the resolution condemning Russia. And the U.S. went to Israel and said, would you co-sponsor the resolution? And the Israelis refused because they did not want to get on Putin's bad side. We should talk a little bit more at some point about Syria and the Russian-Israeli sort of interaction there, but they refused. Then when the actual resolution came for a vote, Israel switched and it voted for it. But the U.S. has sort of asked Israel to adopt the position of the West of opposition to Putin and to the invasion, and Israel has tried to sort of either stay on the sidelines or sort of walk a very tenuous path through all of the different parties here. And I think Putin is probably satisfied with what Israel has done. even when, very interesting, the Israeli Knesset was asked by the Ukrainian ambassador to Israel to have Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to speak to the Knesset, as he has to Congress and to the Parliament in the UK and to Canada's Parliament. And the leadership of the Knesset said, well, he can't speak to Israel in the Knesset itself because we're having renovations done and we're in recess. And the Ukrainian ambassador, the Israeli said, he can speak via Zoom, and the MKs in wherever they are located in Israel from their homes can listen to Zelensky, which was really almost a slap in the face, an insult. And the reason that Israel did this is because it's compromised. It can't take an honest position here because of its ties to Russia and to Putin. Eventually, Zelensky did speak to the Knesset, but he did do it via Zoom, and he excoriated Israel for not being on the right side, not being on the side of the oppressed and the victims. He even invoked the Holocaust and said, Israel's early generation of Holocaust survivors took refuge in Israel after the war. And now that we have a similar situation in Ukraine, where the people of that country are victims of Russian aggression, Israel should be on the side of the victims. That's what their history would dictate. And this made some Israelis furious because, as we know, I mean, quotes, know, that the Holocaust is viewed by Jews and some Jews and Israelis as a unique event that could only happen to Jews. And they want a monopoly on the Holocaust and the issue of genocide. And they do not want anyone to appropriate that, even though we know there have been genocides all over the world. They do not want to allow anyone to use that term against them or to criticize them. So you have this interesting thing happening where Zelensky invokes Israeli history against Israel's position, and it made Israelis very awkward, as they should feel, because they have left Ukrainians in the lurch.
Right. Richard, back to the subject of covert operations, and I hate to keep dwelling on it, but I really do think it's a viable option to take Putin out.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not the oligarchs, why not Mossad? And I'll explain my reasoning. I know I'll explain my reasoning to you. Mossad and Israel are very close to the Ukraine. And in fact, in the European football championships, soccer championships in 2012, which was held in Poland and Ukraine, Mossad was responsible for security for that soccer event. But it goes way beyond that. Israel shares intelligence with Ukraine. There is cooperation in the field of counterterrorism. Israel has trained counter-terrorists in the Ukraine. Israel is granted well-nigh unlimited access to Ukrainian databases, and this facilitates the halting of the influx of undesirable elements not only into Israel, but also the Ukraine, as well as the apprehension of these potential terrorists. And it goes on and on. And to underline that relationship, Israel saw fit to appoint Reverend Daniel, a former Mossad agent, as Israel's ambassador to Ukraine. So this is a very close relationship between the intelligence agencies and counterterrorism agencies between Israel and Ukraine. Let's not forget that the guy who can be coordinating this relationship and the removal of Putin could be our very own CIA director, Bill Burns, who, let's not forget, before he was CIA director, was the United States ambassador to Russia. So he is he is up to his eyeballs in covert operations in this part of the world, and he could certainly coordinate any kind of coup in Russia. Again, Mossad is already in Ukraine. Its ambassador is a former Mossad agent. There is a sharing of intelligence and counterterrorism forces between the two countries, and the United States interests coincide with all of that. Again, do you think, if it's not the oligarchs, do you think Israel could be instrumental in taking out Putin? Well, we can talk about this a little bit more. It's this is the way of the world now. Our show is on national security and foreign policy and intelligence operations, and we have done show after show after show on how the CIA is not just an intelligence operation anymore; it's a paramilitary operation. The kidnapping and the torture and even the execution of terrorists and suspected terrorists, is conducted in black op operations at black sites all over the world by the CIA. And both Republican and Democratic presidents have looked the other way. They've winked at these war crimes. President Barack Obama he requested an opinion from the U.S. Department of Justice on this new role of the CIA, and then he ignored it, from the Faisal court. So again, what covert operations can be engineered to take out Putin, and if not the oligarchs, maybe Mossad.
John, we have Richard
Okay.
back on the line. Did you want to just quickly reframe that question, or
Richard?
I think I got the question.
Okay, good.
The call dropped out, unfortunately. Sorry. Anyway, the Mossad obviously has a long arm and reach, and it engages in operations. That's what it's tasked with: operations outside of Israel. Assassinations, all sorts of activities, including sabotaging of the Iranian nuclear program and assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. So the Mossad theoretically could mount operations inside Russia, and Russia and Israel have a long history of spies by each country on the other. So Mossad definitely has assets inside of Russia. However, I think we have to look at sort of the geopolitical picture here of Israel. Israel is really beholden to Putin and Russia in Syria. And Syria is a big priority for Israel because of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is sworn to opposition to Israel, and Hezbollah both supports Assad in Syria and also engages in military confrontation with Israel, both from Lebanon and Syria. So Israel wants to have a free hand to attack Hezbollah and to attack the Iranians in Syria, who are bringing Iranian weapons and missile technology and actual weaponry through Syria to Lebanon. So Israel wants to have a free hand in attacking those two parties in Syria. And to do that, they have to negotiate with the Russians because the Russians are playing a huge role in Syria as well. So they have to deconflict and make sure that one side doesn't accidentally attack the other. And that has happened. Israeli warplanes basically engaged in an aerial operation that ended with Russian warplanes being shot down over Syria. So it's very important for Israel to make nice with Russia because of its interest in Syria. So, I don't want to sort of argue against what you're saying, John. I think it's possible. But because of Syria, Israel is really both morally and operationally compromised or constrained, I think.
We have a caller for you, Richard. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your question, and please be brief.
Oh, thank you so much. I wanted to pick up on your important comments about geopolitical aspects, Mr. Silverstein. I'm wondering about the recent Israeli-Arab summit. And I'm wondering if and thinking of the way of getting at Putin without being directly at Putin, is there some other things we're not hearing about that summit that might make it possible for Israel and their Arab partners now to bring about some kind of change in Russia or some kind of resolution to the conflict? And I'm particularly thinking about through oil prices, through some kind of economic effect as well as political.
Well, the listener is talking about the Abraham Accords, by which Israel is hoping to sort of co-opt the Arab world. It's a goal that they've had for decades, really since the founding of the state. If they could figure out a way to co-opt some of the Arab states by helping them in their sort of covert activities, by sabotaging or assassinating opposition figures in some of these Arab states. So it's finally succeeded, starting with the Saudis. The Saudis and Israel made a common cause against Iran, and most of these Abraham Accord Arab states are beholden to Saudi Arabia as the sort of big brother state in the region. So you have some of the Gulf states. Although the Saudis haven't formally joined the Abraham Accords, some of these Gulf states, Bahrain, I think the UAE, have joined the Abraham Accords. Basically, the Abraham Accords are an alliance meant to oppose Iran and do engage in sort of activities that will harm or sabotage Iran and its nuclear program. Beyond that, they have very little in common. But what this alliance has done for Israel is it's taken the Palestinian issue off the table. As part of this new alliance, the Arab states basically have agreed that they will stop supporting Palestine, which is a huge change in the Arab approach to that conflict. And it is true, going back to the listener's question, Russia wants to have good relations with the Arab world, and it's basically had no relations, I would say, or very tentative relations with the Arab world. But now that Russia has become a major oil operator in the world, and of course the Middle East states are as well, so they too do find common cause, but I don't see the Arab states as playing. I think that the Arab states and Russia obviously have common interests in terms of propping up the oil price and making sure that the oil exports to the West continue. So it's possible the Arab states would be willing to help Russia in some way because it's facing huge sanctions and it's facing basically the disintegration of its economy because oil is the primary export or maybe the only major export that Russia has. So the Arab world could be sort of co-opted by Russia in some way, but I don't see these 4 or 5 Arab states in this alliance playing any role in sort of undermining Putin, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's an important point. Oil and how Saudi Arabia and Persian Gulf politics play into this war.
We should also remember as well that Israel now has oil and gas interests in the Mediterranean, and they've got these rigs now off the coast of Lebanon and Israel, and they have to interact also with Cyprus, which is in that general sort of territory. But there are Israeli former generals that are reaping oligarch-type benefits from this natural resource, which is definitely not going to the average Israeli, but that's the way it works in Russia and other places as well. So Israel itself is probably not at the level of Saudi Arabia in terms of the reserves of oil and natural gas, but it is one of the small players that's becoming more important.
I agree. Let me ask you a question that's unrelated to anything we've talked about so far in this show, and that is the role of the media and the media's coverage in Ukraine, and when selectivity becomes a kind of propaganda. And I'll tell you where I'm going with this. Um, the U.S. media is blatantly displaying racism by only adequately covering the war between white people, Ukrainians and Russia. In comparison, we see almost no coverage of wars in Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Ethiopia, um, uh, including Israel's own war crimes in Palestine. And the implication is that white lives matter more than white lives matter more than black lives or brown lives. Do you agree that the media has been highly selective in its coverage of the Ukraine-Russian war?
Yes, I certainly agree, but unfortunately, it's nothing new. The media, I mean, if you look back to last year when Israel invaded Gaza, the AP doesn't allow its reporters to use the word Palestine. For God's sakes.
Wow.
If a major international media outlet is censoring its own reporters about something as minor and ridiculous as using the word Palestine, what do you think? What do we think is going on with other media outlets and other issues other than just the use of that one word? So, absolutely, the media. Has gotten religion when it comes to Ukraine. Most of their media, and they're on the right side, but they ignore Palestine, they ignore Yemen, they ignore the suffering of the Palestinian people. It's like we have sort of a tunnel vision, and we only find sympathy for people who are like us,
Right.
Whether it's color or other, commonalities we might have. But
Right.
when color or religion, is not Christian and not white, we have our attention span is goes elsewhere very immediately, and the same issue happens within Israel itself. Israeli Jews, who are the majority in Israel, have no patience and no interest in what its own military, its own intelligence apparatus is doing to Palestinians. They have this apartheid wall between Israel and Palestine, and they have a psychic wall as well. They don't want to know what's happening to the Palestinians. They have no interest at all. They want to keep the Palestinians as far away from themselves as they can, both physically and mentally and politically. So, unfortunately, this is really there really is a double standard here in the media, but it's a long-term double standard. And one of my goals as a journalist is to hold a mirror up to the media, both the Israeli media and the world media, and show the hypocrisy and show the kind of inattention that they have regarding, in my case, my field is Israel and Palestine and related issues. But as you mentioned, it goes far beyond just the Palestinians. But I think they're really a good example of this sort of mental amnesia that the West seems to have about these matters.
That's where I was going with this, Brother Richard. The role of alternative media like you in correcting media bias. Explain that. How does alternative media like your blog, like other alternative media, seek to correct this real bias that the only things they want to cover, are things that are white, things that are European, things that are, culturally at home and comfortable, and the U.S. and Israeli imperialism and war crimes and violations of international law are strictly off the table. How does alternative media correct that? And keep in mind, we're having Norman Solomon as our next guest.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, I know his work, and he's great. And Abba Solomon, I think maybe his son, also very supportive to progressive position. But anyway, I fill a kind of a unique role, if I may say, because Israel is what I call a national security state. It has put security up on a high altar, and the Israelis are willing to sacrifice their personal, their individual rights on this altar of security. So they've given almost absolute power to the military and to the intelligence apparatus to engage in whatever sorts of activities that they want, and there's no oversight. Technically, there's some oversight, but it doesn't exist in reality. We want to talk about the Pegasus spyware. Perfect example, there's a Israeli company exporting this incredibly dangerous spyware that security services in Mexico and Azerbaijan and all sorts of other 45 or so other countries are using this spyware exported from Israel to suppress and harass human rights advocates, dissidents, human rights lawyers, etc. So it's a perfect example. Israel's defense ministry is supposed to license this export, and it basically gives Pegasus carte blanche until the alternative media and the digital human rights people around the world turn on Pegasus and start to expose what it's doing. And that's the only leverage, the only way that we can stop Israel in its tracks from some of the worst excesses that it's engaging in. And I play a little bit different role because Israel, this national security state I mentioned, is under military censorship. It's also its police and its intelligence apparatus are able to get judicial gag orders, which basically prevent Israeli media from serving the role that good, healthy media serves in other places in Western democracies, for example. So it stops the Israeli reporters from being able to report on major stories inside their own country. And that's where I step in because I live here in the Northwest, and I'm not subject, thank goodness, to any jurisdiction of Israeli military or intelligence. So I have sources that are willing to report these national security secrets. And that's one of my main tasks. It's to expose the secrets, as you mentioned earlier, of the national security state to, for example, there have been 3 terrorist attacks over the past week in Israel. Until now, no media has reported who is behind the terror attacks, who is sponsoring these Palestinians who are attacking Israelis. And so I have a source who identified one of the Palestinian groups which is behind it, at least one of these attacks. But the Israeli media can't report any of that because security apparatus in Israel wants to keep a lid on it for various reasons. Eventually they will probably reveal this information, but they want to keep things secret. And, we know what happens with secrecy. Suppressing knowledge, suppressing the ability of the public to know what's being done in its name. It's really a toxic stew. We've seen it happen in the U.S. when our security services, our intelligence agencies are able to keep things secret. I mean, look at Edward Snowden, what he did. And look at the program, look at the hostility and anger that he faced by revealing secrets of the NSA. You have, I think it was Trump and a couple of other sort of senior people said that Snowden should be assassinated or should be hung. So there are interests, these intelligence interests in Israel and other places that don't want the public to know, because if there was light shown on what they're doing, the world would react in horror and anger, like what it happened to Pegasus. So that's the role that we play. We don't let them get away with their worst activities. We hold a light up to them. We let the world know what they're doing, and they hate us for it. And I have my share of love letters, that I call them, that come my way. Luckily, there has been no official attacks on me, from government figures, and I'm somewhat protected because I'm a U.S. citizen. But if I went to Israel to do a reporting trip, very likely I would be detained and interrogated by security services, probably probably deported as Noam Chomsky was, and several other figures like us have gone to Israel and been deported. We're threats to this security state.
Right. We have about 7 minutes left with Richard Silverstein. We do have another caller. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your question and please be brief.
Yes, I think it's to the subject of the media that you're just talking to. What's your reaction to the removal of Chris Hedges from YouTube? Hundreds of thoughtful interviews, nothing. He condemned the actions, calling them illegal, of Russia, and yet I don't hear anybody. Of course, the right won't miss him, and neither will the left, apparently. What's your reaction to the purge of Chris Hedges?
Geez, every day brings a new outrage. That's all I can say. I didn't even know about Chris Hedges being taken off YouTube. If that happened, it's just outrageous. I don't know, what the rationale that YouTube used to do this, but in some ways, it's not surprising. If you look at Israel itself, it has a huge lobbying campaign with social media platforms like YouTube, Google, Twitter, Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg is very tight with the Israel lobby, and he's been to Israel and he's met with the Prime Minister Netanyahu. So Israel goes directly to these social media sites and says and reports, tens of thousands of Palestinians and other content that Israel deems to be sort of hostile or anti-Israel. And the platforms are very receptive to this. They walk a fine line because they have to say that we're not censoring content, and we are being careful, and we are, supporting free speech. But when it comes to somebody who rocks the boat like Chris Hedges, you can only go so far before you sort of come come to the attention of either Israel or Chris has offended many different elements, so any one of them could be exerting pressure on Google to take him off. But the other thing about Chris that's interesting is he began his career as a reporter, I think, for the New York Times in Israel. And some of his reporting from Israel was incredibly powerful. He would go and he would watch protests, and he would describe Palestinian children being gunned down by the IDF in the middle of protests. That was a very powerful message that he was able to spread, and he's gone on to take on many, many other important issues. So I'm hoping that is the case, but if it is, I wouldn't be surprised. But we have to fight back against that. We have to exert pressure on platforms like Google and tell them this isn't acceptable. They do respond to pressure in this way sometimes.
Right. We have just 4 minutes left, and in 2 minutes or less, maybe you could tell us, since this war may not be over for months, years, how do you see this playing out long term for Israel, since they're kind of dancing around this? And the second question I'd have is if you would give listeners information about how to follow your work.
Sure. Following my work is done through my blog, which is called Tikun Olam. My URL is my name, richardsilverstein.com. I do publish at several publications that your listeners may not know but should. Middle East Eye is one of them. The New Arab is another. And once in a while I get Al Jazeera to take some of my work, and Jacobin Magazine. So those are the other places. In terms of the long term with Israel, I think it right now, even though Russia is in a very tenuous situation, both economically and militarily, and we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, because even though Russia is weakened, it supplies 40% of the natural gas to Europe. So, can Europe develop alternative sources for what it's getting from Russia? Russia still has leverage in that way. So, and I think Russia still has leverage in Syria, and because Israel is locked in a death grip struggle against Iran, Syria becomes a huge factor for Israel. So, I think Russia is sort of like a dying snake. It may be dying, but it can still bite and has a ferocious, ability to protect itself and its interests. So I think Israel is going to continue to try to walk a fine line
Right.
in terms of Russia.
And not make any commitment to condemning Putin. Richard, we are out of time, unfortunately, and we do want to have you back as things progress related to Israel, Ukraine, Russia, etc. And we thank you for returning with us actually at this time. So once again, we've been speaking with Richard Silverstein. John, would you like to say a final word?
Yes, Richard, thank you so much for being a guest again. I hope to, our ties go way back to when we were teenagers. And
Yep, high school in New York.
and New York on the other side of the country.
Right.
And I had a lot of respect for you then, and I have a lot of respect for you now. Keep the good work. You're an important voice, in the alternative media, especially as it relates to Israel. So keep up the good work. I hope our listeners continue to support you. I hope you'll listen to our next show on April 7th with Norman Solomon.
I'll be there.
Like yourself, a leading progressive, speaks truth to power. And I want to remind our listeners that KMUD's Spring Pledge Drive is currently underway. Mary and I are putting our individual memberships in. I think 2 checks will go in 1 envelope.
Correct. I have the envelope.
And we look forward to you joining the KMUD family. Thank you very much, Richard, for being a guest on the show, and we hope to have you back soon.
Thanks as always, John. It's been a pleasure.
You bet. We appreciate everyone who's tuned in today. This is Heroes and Patriots. Mary Massey and co-host John Sakowicz. We'll be back next Thursday, April 7th, the first Thursday of the month, 9 to 10 a.m. live with Norman Solomon, who has been on our show several times. So we hope that you'll join us next Thursday morning. And until then, thank you for tuning in.